In this video, you will learn about forces, and we will learn what are the different types of contact and non-contact forces. A very basic definition of what a force is would be an external agent that can act on an object and cause it to change its velocity. For example, imagine there's a box sitting on the ground and a person comes over and pushes it. That would be a pushing force. Or we have a box with a rope attached to it and a person comes and pulls on it. That would be a pulling force. In both examples, a force is being applied to the object and causing it to change its velocity. Let's look at another example. Imagine there's a car driving along the road. The car is moving because the engine is applying a thrust force, which is pushing the car forward. But because the car is on a rough surface, there's also a friction force acting against it. Let's look at another example. Imagine we have a person who's throwing a ball up into the air. Why does the ball come back down? Well, because gravity is pushing against it. This would be the force of gravity. Based on these examples, I hope you can tell that forces are all around us and we use them every single day to move objects or move ourselves. Now, there are two broad categories of forces. We have contact forces and non-contact forces, also called long-range forces. Let's look at contact forces. These are forces where the external agent that's applying the force is in direct contact with the object. We have the pushing force, where the object is being pushed. We have pulling forces, and if we're dealing with an object connected to a rope or a cable, we would call that tension. We have the thrust force. You can imagine an airplane or a rocket flying through the air, or a car driving along the road. These objects have engines, and they're using the force of thrust to push the objects. We have the spring force, which is when an object is connected to a spring, and that spring can be stretched or compressed and then push or pull the object. We have the friction force, which occurs when an object is on a rough surface, and the friction force acts to slow that object down. We have the force of drag, which we can also call air resistance. So imagine we have a skydiver that's falling through the air. We know gravity is pushing them down, but the air is also pushing up against them. And then we have the normal force. The normal force is the force that the surface applies to the object. So for example, if you place your phone on a table, we know gravity is pushing down on that phone. So what's stopping it from being pushed through the table? Well, the table is pushing back up against the phone, and that's the normal force. And the normal force is always perpendicular to the surface. Now let's look at non-contact forces. These are forces where the external agent that's applying the force is not in direct contact with the object. So you can think of gravity. We know if we throw a ball from the top of a building, it's going to fall down, and that's because gravity is pushing down on the ball. We also have the magnetic force. So we know if we bring two magnets together, they will either repel or attract. So we can either have a repulsive or an attractive force. And then we have the electric force, which is the force between charged objects. And we know opposite charges attract and like charges repel. So now that we understand the different types of forces, I just want to end by reminding you that forces are vectors. And we know from kinematics that a vector has both magnitude and direction. The magnitude is the size of the force, and the direction is the direction that the force was applied. And because forces are vectors, you can add them together or subtract them. And multiple forces can act on a single object. And that is the end of this brief introduction to forces. Now it's time to learn about how you can visualize these force vectors using free body diagrams.